Hi there, my name is Devin Knight, and this is another video in a series that I've been working on around Power Automate and solving some more complex problems. And our previous video, our first video, we walked through how you can create a Power Automate flow to populate a Word template. So the process that we did in our last example was I had a certificate of completion and I wanted to ensure that everyone could get a certificate of completion sent to them that was personalized to them by them simply filling out a Microsoft form. This was the actual flow here that we developed in the last video, and you can find the link to our previous video down in the bottom description if you'd like to take a peek at that. Now, what we're going to be doing in this new video is taking things to the next step here. What I want to do is I want to make it not only that we send a certification or a certificate of completion, I should say, to our attendees for our various classes that they attend, but I also want to make this a step further where they can actually have, inside the email that I send to them, a link and a hyperlink that allows them to click a button to share their certification on LinkedIn. So I want them to be able to share with everyone that follows them on LinkedIn to share information about the fact that they attended a class with Pragmatic Works or your company or whoever it may be. And so what I'd like to do is I want to capture an image of that certificate of completion and then put that image inside of a LinkedIn shared message. That's my goal. And LinkedIn does make this available. Just to give you a little peek at what LinkedIn does for you, let's look at my PC here for a moment. If you are thinking about doing something like this, LinkedIn does have a URL that you can have and that you can use to be able to share things like articles, and you can make them dynamic so that way they can very easily be shared with others. And so I want to show you what that looks like, an example of what that looks like. This is the URL that you can kind of parse together to be able to return back and show and share with others about the, in this case, certificate of completion that was done with my company, Pragmatic Works. So this is a URL, and if we were to plug this URL into our web browser here, check out what happens. It's going to launch a post where I can share this post, and it's going to share on my feed with inside of LinkedIn. It has an image of the certificate of completion, and I can simply type in some kind of message saying thank you for Pragmatic Works, blah, blah, blah. And of course, it's a great way to be able to share with others that you completed a class, but it's also a great way for the company that's like myself, Pragmatic Works, to be able to get more message about our company and the classes that we have done kind of naturally where others would share about what they've done with us. So that's my goal. Now, there are some challenges with this that I want to talk through. And specifically this video, we're not going to get quite to the point where we will actually have this message prepared with the image. We're going to get to this in the next video. But the challenge that I found when working on the solution was the idea of being able to get this image to display like we have here. My first inclination was to take the PDF that we created before, make it into a JPEG, which is not very difficult to do in Power Automate. But then I wanted to make it so that that image could be shared through OneDrive. However, the challenge with that is even if you make an anonymous link through OneDrive and a shareable link through OneDrive, here is what happens when you attempt to share it on LinkedIn. So if I were to do this exact same image with the exact same URL but point it to OneDrive instead of somewhere else, the place I'm using right now, if I were to attempt to do this instead, watch what happens. This is the message that gets returned back. Something went wrong. Even though this is an anonymous link, you're noticing here that it's not actually bringing across the image of my certificate of completion. So OneDrive I ruled out as an option because even with anonymous links, they were not able to be shared through LinkedIn. So what my alternative was that I turned to was Azure Blob storage. So by taking the image that we created or the PDF that we created, we could very easily convert that file into an image. I'll show you how to do that in OneDrive. But the bigger challenge that we're going to be tackling in today's class is how to store that image in Azure Blob storage. And so we're going to start at the very beginning process of that. We're going to show you how to create a storage account, and then how do we create a container. And we're going to go through really all of the process that goes into that to be able to set yourself up to create and store images in blob storage and then use that image later on with inside of a flow. So to get started, we are going to go to the Azure Portal. Now you can do this yourself if you even have just a trial account of Azure. So if you want to just sign up for the free trial account, it gives you, I believe, $150 a month that you can try Azure with and experience it. And I happen to have an Azure account already. However, you could use a trial account most certainly to be able to follow along this example. But we're going to get started by going to the Azure Portal, which can be found at portal.azure.com. And once I get signed in, I'm already happen to be signed in here, I'm going to create a new resource, and more specifically, I'm going to create a storage account, which you can see down here on the bottom. So we're going to be creating a storage account, and that storage account is what we're going to have to store our images. So I'm going to go ahead and select that we want to create a storage account, and we're going to choose, when we prompt that we want to create a new storage account, it's going to ask us which subscription do we want to have that storage account in. And this is where you could likely select your trial subscription. So if you have a trial subscription where you have a limited amount of money, this is very low cost to be able to do this example. So no problem here doing this on that low cost plan that's available through the trial. But you would select your subscription where I'm showing right now, and then you would also select your resource group. Now, a resource group is basically a container that holds all of your resources, all your services that you're leveraging within Azure that are part of this unit of work. And so what I want to do, just because I don't want to assume that you already have resource groups or you know what they are, we're going to create a resource group here rather quickly. So I'm going to hit Create New, and we're going to call this our YouTube Certification, I'll spell it right, Example. All right, so I'm going to create a new resource group called that, and I'll hit OK. And then we're going to come down and give the storage account a name here as well. Now, as you type in the name of the storage account, you can really name it whatever you want, but do know that you are not going to have spaces. You can't have spaces in it, and you need to have everything be lowercase as well. So as you start to type, make sure you do that here. So I'm going to go ahead and type in something like, let's call this my YouTube. Here, I already have one right there. My YouTube certification storage account that's going to get created. You can determine which region you want it to be in. I happen to be in the East US, so I'm going to leave it as that. And you can determine what kind of plan you want it to be on, but we're going to make this part as smooth as possible as it allows, and we're just going to hit Review and Create. I'm not going to worry about getting into the advanced settings here for this example. We're just going to hit Review and Create down here in the bottom left, and then once we do that, it's going to create our storage account for us here pretty shortly. So all we have to do here, you can look over the settings. These are more advanced settings if you wanted to dig into those. I'm less concerned about those for the purposes of what we're doing today. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Create, and that will start the creation of our storage account. It'll usually take about 15-20 seconds. It's not terribly too long to create the storage account, but once the account is created, we're then going to need to do a few things. One, we're going to need to go get a container created inside of our storage account. We're going to need to also find the access keys, so the keys that we can use to be able to pass in a Power Automate to actually leverage this storage account, and a few other things that we'll need along the way. But we're going to take just a moment there. You can see my storage account is already created. It only took a few moments there. And we're going to go ahead and click on the Go to Resources option right here. And that will take us to see the details of our new storage account that we created. So I'll go ahead and select that. All right, so here's all the details of our storage account. There's a couple things that we're going to need over time here that I want to highlight. We're going to keep this pretty light here as we work our way through this, but a couple things that we're going to need to do initially here. One, we're going to need to create a container. You can find that on the left-hand side. A container is like a folder that allows you to group together, in our case, as images, but essentially files. You can have all sorts of different files within inside of a container on your storage account. They don't have to be just images like we're using for this example. But we're going to go ahead and select the storage account, and we're going to create a new storage account. So we'll go ahead and select Container to create a new container. And on the far right-hand side, we're going to give this new container a name. So I'm going to go ahead and take myself off screen here for a moment, and we'll zoom in on that. All right, so for the name, you can call it really whatever you want here, but what we're going to do is we're going to call this one something very simple like certifications. All right. And then I'm going to go ahead and change the public access level to be public, and we're going to make this the blob public because we are going to want to have the ability to access these files from outside of our organization. We want to allow our individual users to be able to connect to these files, so we're going to make this anonymous read access to the files within inside of it. All right, so once we've done that, we can go ahead and hit Create down at the bottom. So I'll select Create. and it's going to create our, by the way, I think the create button was behind me, right, when I went ahead and put myself on screen. But it's going to create a container, which again essentially is like a folder. You can see that right here. I can select the container if I wanted to take a look at it. You can even go look at the properties of the container. You can see the URL where the container lives. So this URL is where all of the files are going to be stored. And we will need a URL, but not necessarily this one. We'll come back to the need for the URL a bit later. But what we're going to do next, we're going to go back to the resources here, and we need to find the access keys. You can find the access keys on the left-hand side of your screen way over here. And inside the access key section, that's going to be kind of your key to get into the container and into the storage account from within inside of Power Automate. So this is going to come in handy later. If I go to access keys, you'll see right now these are hidden from me. I will share them on my screen here in a little bit because I'm not going to keep this container long term. I'm going to delete it right after this video is done. But I'm going to go ahead and select that I want to show the keys. And then I'm going to use the key on the top here, not the connection string, but the one above it. I'm going to use that key within inside of Power Automate here in a few moments. So we've really kind of set the stage for everything we need so far. I'm going to leave this window open, and then we're going to come back to it once we're ready to actually copy this key out. And we need a few other things from here as well. So let's actually go back over to our Power Automate solution that we developed previously. This is the same solution that you saw that we did in our last video. Again, if you want to find the link to in the description to where we created this flow, you can find that down in the description. But what we're going to do is we want to make an image from the Word document that we created here. So remember back to our previous video, we populated a Word template right here. We go to create that as a Word file, and then we convert that file to a PDF right here. So we got a lot of things going on, but now what I want to do is, in addition to doing a PDF, I still want that PDF sent to my students, but I also want to have an image so that image can be shared on LinkedIn. So we're going to need to add in another action, and we're going to add that action right here where it says insert a new step, and we're going to add an action. And the action type that we're going to add is another convert file. So this really shows you why it's a best practice to go through and rename these. I should have gone through and renamed this one, and I should have called this convert file PDF. And then I'm going to create another convert file, and this one's going to be to convert it to a JPEG. So I'm going to go ahead and select convert to file. And I'll rename this one just to make sure I'm covering my bases here. I'm going to say convert file JPEG. So that way I know which one is which one is converting to what file type. All right, so now with inside of the file where it said the property here for file where it says the unique identifier for my file, I'm going to capture the ID for the file that's being used. You can see it's the same ID column that I use right here. I could even copy and paste that down if I really wanted to. One little trick, by the way, if you're unsure where this came from, if you're unsure what dynamic content this came from, I could actually select this and copy and paste it somewhere else. Or I could even go into the expression section here and paste it in, and I can see, oh, it looks like this came from the create file action right here. So now I know it came from this one. So that's a little tip for you. If you're unsure where some of these things come from, copy and paste them somewhere else, and you can take a look. All right, so that tells me that in our new action here for converting the file to a JPEG, we're going to select the dynamic content coming from the create file action. So we're going to come down to create file and select the ID column found right here, just like we did in the previous action. So I'm going to grab that and place that into our dynamic content area or our property for the file. Then I want to change the target file type to JPEG. So we're trying to create an image. So I'm going to go ahead and select that I want this to be created as a JPEG here. All right, this step is done. So we have a PDF that gets created. We have a JPEG file that gets created. Now, after the JPEG file gets created, we are going to send that file into Azure Blob Storage. Because again, the problem is if we were to just send it into OneDrive, it wouldn't work with our LinkedIn process that we're trying to create, where we're trying to automate the sharing to LinkedIn. So I'm going to go ahead and select that I want to add in a new step after our convert file to JPEG, and we're going to add an action. And this is going to be our create blob action. So you'll see there's an action right here called create blob, and we're going to use that action to be able to create this file that we just designed, that we just converted to a JPEG, and we're going to store it inside of Azure Blob Storage. So I'm going to go ahead and select create blob. We are going to leave this as access key. You could also make it actually authenticate with your Azure AD, your Azure Active Directory account. We don't want that for this in this use case. We're going to stick to the access keys. We're then going to provide the storage account name. So the storage account name is going to be whatever the name was that we had right here. Here's the storage account. Here's the storage account name. You can go back to overview if you want. You can find the name here as well. But the resource group was called YouTube certification example. The actual container itself is up in the top right called YouTube certification. So I'm going to copy that name, bring that over to Power Automate, and paste that in. All right. Then the final step here is we are going to need to provide the access keys. So we talked about access keys earlier. We actually had it on our screen just a moment ago. We're going to go back over to Azure Portal, and we're going to go to access keys on the left-hand side here again. So that way we can find the keys that are required. All right, so we're going to go ahead and show our keys, and we're going to copy the first key that we have. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And then we're going to go back over to Power Automate and paste it in. Easy enough. All right, so once we've done that, we'll hit Create, and that's going to create this connection within inside of my Power Automate environment, my Devin Knight environment here. That will have a new connection that gets created within inside of it. Once we hit Create, take just a few moments. And now that the connection is created, and by the way, you can validate the connection is created by going underneath the menu here. You can see the connection right here for this Azure Blob storage account. But now we're going to go through and we're going to select the name of the storage account. We're going to select the folder we want it to look at, and then we're going to pass in what is the file we're trying to create within inside of the container inside the storage account. So we're going to go ahead and select the storage account name here, which is just simply going to point to the connection that we created just a moment ago. So this is just pointing to the connection string that we set up a few moments ago. Then we'll select the folder that we wanted to navigate, which we only have one folder. We have a folder called certification, so we'll go ahead and select that one folder here. Simple enough. And then we're going to select the blob name and the content name that we want created inside of Azure. Now, the method that we're going to use for this is we're going to capture the dynamic content again from our create file action, which you can find right here as well. And the blob name is going to be the file name, and the blob content is going to be the file content. So we're going to use those two properties, the two dynamic properties from our earlier action, and we're going to paste those here inside of our create blob action. All right, so we're going to go ahead and select for the file, the blob name, that's going to be our file name. For the blob content, that's going to be our file content. All right, looking good. So we've got that set up. Everything should be good to create the file, but now how do I retrieve the file name back? I need some method for retrieving back the name of the file that we're attempting to use here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable after the file gets created right here. So I'm going to create a new variable where it says insert a new step right after the create blob action. By the way, we are done with the Azure Blob storage piece of this video. That we've got that working. Now we're just going to have to create an action to call back to that blob storage to return back the URL that we need to use. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a new step and add in a new action. And we will make this a initialize variable action. You can find right here. So we're going to select initialize variable. I'll select that as well. And then we'll go ahead and give the variable a name, but basically we're trying to return back a URL for the image. So we'll call this var str, and we'll call this a certification image URL. All right, so this is going to be a string, as the name implies right here. So we'll go ahead and change the value type to string, the variable type to string. Then in the value section, we're going to need to build out a little bit of dynamic content, but to give us a little bit of a head start and make this a lot easier for us, we're going to go back to Azure and find the URL for this storage account. There is a URL that's associated with a storage account. I actually showed you a URL for the container earlier. It's very similar to that, but that URL was a little bit lengthier than what we needed. So what we can do is we can go back over to Azure Portal, and we are looking for the properties of our Azure storage account here. So if you were looking to try and find the URL that you would need to connect to for this particular storage account, you can find that. One of the ways, again, I showed earlier was you can actually go to the container. So if I went over to the container, I could find it there. Remember, we went into the container, select it. If you select the properties of the container over here on the left-hand side, you can see the URL right here. So we need something like this URL. We just don't need the word certifications at the end of it. You can find the exact URL by going back over to the storage account. So let me go back over to the storage account where the resources can be found. And if we navigate on the left-hand side to the section here called endpoints, this is underneath the settings. So underneath settings, you'll find endpoints. If you select endpoints, that will find you or show you the URL for this storage account. So there's all sorts of URLs that are available to us here. Again, if you were to try and go to any of these URLs, they'll be a little useless later. I'll delete the storage account. But the URL that we're going to need for our example is the one a little bit down here where it says primary endpoint. So right here, where it says primary endpoint, that's the URL that we need. So we're going to take that URL, it's actually going to be this one. Let's see, let me make sure I get us the right one here. We could always just go back to the URL that I had earlier, but we want the one that says blob in the URL. Oh, I went a little too high. Here it is right here. So we want this URL that says blob services primary endpoint. And so I'm going to copy this URL over here on the far right-hand side of my screen. I can hit that, or I can just highlight it and copy it. But I'm going to go ahead and copy that URL and bring that URL back into Power Automate. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to Power Automate, paste in that URL. That's going to be the beginning part of our URL, and I'm actually going to get rid of the / that's at the beginning of it, or the end of it there. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to parse together the URL that we just copied from Azure, and we're going to go find from the create blob action, there is a dynamic content, again, coming from this action, also found down here. We're going to bring back the path. So the path dynamic content value is found right here, and we're going to put that just at the end of this URL that we just created. We didn't need the /, it's not necessary. It actually has that / inside of the path variable already. So we're going to go ahead and put our cursor at the end of this URL, select path, and that will build together this dynamic path for us. All right, so things are looking pretty good. So now all we have to do is we're going to go into our send an email action. This will be our final step in our final video. That's going to be it for today. But in our final video, we are going to actually show how to take this URL, inject it into our email to be able to send a message to our users that not only has a PDF attached certification, but also how we can make it so that they can have a URL that allows them to share to LinkedIn. I want to give them the ability to click one button, share the fact that they completed this certificate of completion in their LinkedIn profile or in their LinkedIn feed, so others know how they went through this training recently. So that's our goal in our next video. If you like this one, of course, make sure you like it, but don't forget also, we have a lot of people that watch our videos that haven't subscribed yet, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you're notified whenever we do release more videos. But that's it for today's video. And this one, again, as a reminder, we learned how to create an Azure Blob storage account, how we then were able to interconnect that into Power Automate, and then we wrapped it up with showing how to parse a URL so we could actually capture the file. And the next one will show to the final conclusion to this little series on how to actually now make this a shared message on LinkedIn. Hope you enjoyed this one. We'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much.